The black box recording would later reveal that Captain Zara Ghost, Achafar's final transmission, lasted exactly 14 seconds. 14 seconds that would haunt the Pentagon's corridors for months, played and replayed by analysts who couldn't understand how she'd maintained such clinical precision, while her F-35 Lightning II disintegrated around her at 22,000 feet above the Afghan mountains. Mayday, Mayday, Ghost 77. Multiple engine failures, hydraulics gone, losing altitude fast. Last known position 37 degrees, 4 minutes north, 69 degrees, 18 minutes east. Aircraft unrecoverable. Tell my daughter I kept my promise. The transmission cut to static at 3:47 hours on a moonless October morning. By dawn, the largest search and rescue operation in theater history was already mobilizing. Yet even as MH-60 Blackhawks thundered toward the crash coordinates, whispers spread through the Tactical Operations Center like wildfire. Ghost had finally pushed too far. The untouchable pilot who'd earned her call sign by vanishing into enemy airspace and emerging with impossible intelligence had met her match in the Hindu Kush. Colonel Marcus Webb, Ghost's commanding officer, stood before the massive tactical display, his weathered face betraying nothing as red search grids expanded across the mountainous terrain. But those who knew him caught the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped his coffee mug. Ghost wasn't just another pilot to him. She was the daughter he'd never had, the prodigy who'd arrived at Bagram Air Base 3 years ago carrying a distinguished flying cross and a reputation that preceded her like thunder. The other pilots called her Ghost because she flew like a phantom, appearing where the enemy least expected, striking with surgical precision, then vanishing before retaliation could find her. But Webb knew the real reason behind the call sign. Ghost was running from something, using the cockpit as her sanctuary, the endless blue above Afghanistan as her escape from whatever haunted her stateside. Now, as dawn painted the operations center in harsh fluorescent light, Webb watched his best pilot's life reduced to data points on a screen. Crash probability algorithms calculated her survival chances at less than 2%. The mountains she'd vanished into were a graveyard of aircraft and dreams, where temperatures plunged to -40 and Taliban forces moved like wolves through valleys that had swallowed armies whole. But the analysts didn't know Ghost the way Webb did. They didn't know about the daughter waiting in Virginia, about the promise she'd whispered before every mission, or about the steel-wrapped determination that had carried her through situations that would have broken lesser pilots. They didn't know that Ghost Achafar didn't just survive the impossible, she made it look routine. The search would begin at first light. What they'd find would rewrite every survival manual in the military. Captain Zara Achafar had been dead for exactly 4 hours when she opened her eyes to a world painted in blood and twisted metal. The F-35's ejection seat had saved her life, but barely. Her left shoulder screamed with each breath, and something warm trickled down her forehead, painting her vision crimson. Through the cracked visor of her helmet, she could see the lightning's remains scattered across a narrow valley like the bones of some metallic beast. The silence was absolute. No radio chatter, no distant rotors, no sounds of civilization, just the whisper of wind through jagged peaks that stretched endlessly in every direction. She tried moving her legs first, relief flooding through her when they responded. Her right arm hung useless, the shoulder definitely dislocated, but she was alive. Against every statistical probability, Ghost had cheated death once more. She keyed her survival radio with shaking fingers. Static answered back, the mountains swallowing her transmissions like hungry mouths. The GPS coordinates on her wrist display showed her position as a blinking dot surrounded by thousands of square miles of nothing. She was 73 miles from the nearest friendly outpost, in terrain where rescue helicopters feared to venture. But Ghost had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Every survival course, every mountain training exercise, every cold weather operation had been leading to this valley, this test. She thought of Aaliyah, her 8-year-old daughter, probably sleeping peacefully in their Virginia Beach apartment, unaware that Mommy's war had just taken its most dangerous turn. The promise echoed in her mind. "I'll always come home to you, baby girl, always." Ghost began taking inventory. Her survival kit was intact: water purification tablets, emergency rations for 5 days, signaling mirror, first aid supplies, and her grandfather's compass, a gift from Nigeria that had guided her through every deployment. Her sidearm was secure in its holster, though she prayed she wouldn't need it. The real enemy here wasn't human, it was the mountain itself, already beginning its nightly transformation into a frozen hell. As darkness crept across the valley like spilled ink, Ghost found shelter beneath a portion of the aircraft's wing that had embedded itself in the rocky slope. She forced her dislocated shoulder back into its socket, biting down on her flight glove to muffle the scream that tore from her throat. The joint was damaged but functional. It would have to do. Her watch read 21:30 hours. Day one was ending, and already she understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. The mountains had claimed her aircraft, but they hadn't claimed her. Not yet. Ghost pulled her survival blanket tighter and began planning her descent toward civilization. Somewhere far below, Taliban radio chatter crackled through the night. They'd heard the crash too. The first Taliban patrol found the crash site at 6:30 hours, just as Ghost was filtering her first cup of morning water through a makeshift charcoal screen. She watched them through a gap in the aircraft debris, counting 6 fighters armed with AK-47s and an RPG. Their leader, a bearded man with intelligent eyes, examined the wreckage methodically while his subordinates spread out in a search pattern. Ghost held her breath as one fighter passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot. She could smell his cigarette smoke, hear him muttering prayers in Pashto as he poked through twisted metal. Her hand rested on her sidearm's grip, though she knew that drawing it would be suicide. 6 against 1 in open terrain, even Ghost couldn't win those odds. The leader barked orders, and the patrol began climbing toward higher ground, following what they assumed was her escape route. Ghost waited until their voices faded before allowing herself to breathe. They'd made a crucial mistake, assuming she'd try to reach the peaks for better radio reception. Instead, she'd go down, into the valleys where aircraft couldn't follow but where water ran and where, eventually, all paths led to civilization. She waited another hour before moving, using the delay to treat her wounds more thoroughly. The head injury was superficial, but her left wrist was definitely fractured. She fashioned a splint from cockpit debris and parachute cord, then redistributed her gear for the long walk ahead. The survival radio went dark to preserve batteries. She'd only activate it during scheduled search windows. By 800 hours, Ghost was moving south along the valley floor, following a dry riverbed that showed signs of seasonal water flow. Her map indicated this watershed eventually connected to larger systems that fed into populated areas. It was her best chance, though it would take her deeper into Taliban-controlled territory with each mile. The landscape was brutally beautiful, razor-sharp ridges cutting into a sky so blue it hurt to look at, ancient stone formations that had witnessed the passage of empires. But beauty was a luxury Ghost couldn't afford. Every shadow might hide an enemy, every sound might herald discovery. She moved like the ghost she was, flowing across the terrain with minimal disturbance, pausing frequently to listen and observe. By midday, she'd covered 8 miles and reached a point where the valley began to widen. Here, she found the first signs of human habitation: old goat trails etched into the hillsides, the remains of stone shelters used by nomadic herders. She was entering the space between worlds, where the empty mountains gave way to the dangerous territory of human conflict. Ghost took shelter in one of the ancient shelters and allowed herself a brief meal of survival rations. The food tasted like cardboard, but it was fuel for the journey ahead. As she ate, she studied her map, plotting the next phase of her escape. 65 miles to friendly forces, 46 days of rations if she was careful. The math was brutal but possible. She thought of Aaliyah again, imagining her daughter's face when the military chaplain knocked on their door. No, that wasn't going to happen. Ghost had made a promise, and she'd never broken a promise to her daughter. Not when Aaliyah's father had walked away, not through 3 deployments, and not now. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent when Ghost heard the helicopters. The sound echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to determine direction, but she recognized the distinctive thrum of American rotors. Search and rescue, finally responding to her beacon from the night before. She grabbed her signaling mirror and scrambled toward an open area where she might be visible from above. The sound grew louder, then began to fade. Ghost flashed her mirror desperately, sending reflected sunlight dancing across the peaks, but the helicopters continued their search pattern in the wrong direction. They were following the same assumption as the Taliban patrol, that she tried to reach high ground for rescue. As the sound of rotors faded into silence, Ghost felt the weight of her isolation settle over her like a physical thing. The rescue teams were looking, but they were looking in the wrong places. She was truly on her own now, with nothing but her training, her determination, and the promise she'd made to a little girl who needed her mother to come home. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came the cold that could kill as surely as any bullet. Ghost had found better shelter in a cave formed by fallen boulders, its entrance concealed from casual observation. She'd gathered enough dry brush to risk a small fire, shielded deep within the rocky chamber where its light couldn't be seen from outside. The flames danced hypnotically as she tended to her wounds and checked her equipment. Her water supply was holding steady thanks to the purification tablets, but food was already becoming a concern. The standard survival rations were calculated for rescue within 72 hours, not for a cross-country trek through hostile territory. She'd need to supplement them somehow, though the barren landscape offered few options. Her encrypted radio crackled to life during the scheduled communication window. Ghost keyed the transmit button and whispered into the darkness. Any station, this is Ghost 77. Day 2, continuing movement south. Still mission capable. Tell Angel 6 I'm keeping my promise. Static answered her. The mountains were too effective at blocking signals, and she was moving farther from friendly forces with each mile. But speaking the words aloud gave her strength. Angel 6 was her call sign for Aaliyah, a private joke between them about her daughter being her guardian angel. Somewhere across the world, her little girl was probably having breakfast before school, unaware that her mother was fighting for her life in a frozen wilderness. Ghost closed her eyes and remembered the last time she'd seen Aaliyah, just before this deployment. They'd been at the beach, building sandcastles as the sun set over the Atlantic. Aaliyah had looked up at her with those impossibly serious eyes and asked, "Mommy, are you scared when you fly?" Ghost had knelt in the sand and taken her daughter's small hands in hers. "Sometimes, baby girl, but I'm never scared of coming home to you. That's the one thing I'm never scared of." Now, huddled in a cave 8,000 miles from that beach, Ghost held onto that memory like a lifeline. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every decision from now on would be measured against one simple criterion. Would it get her closer to Aaliyah? She banked the fire and settled back against the stone wall, her body finally beginning to process the trauma of the crash. Every muscle ached, and her fractured wrist throbbed with each heartbeat. But she was alive, mobile, and moving toward safety. In the morning, she'd continue south, following the ancient paths that traders and armies had used for thousands of years. The last sound she heard before sleep claimed her was the distant howl of wind through the peaks, a sound like the voices of all the pilots who hadn't made it home, singing her toward whatever waited in the valleys below. Dawn brought the bitter reality of her situation into sharp focus. Ghost's water bottle had frozen solid overnight despite being tucked inside her flight suit, and ice crystals decorated the inside of her makeshift shelter. The temperature had dropped below zero, and her breath clouded in the thin air as she worked to restart circulation in her extremities. The survival manual called this the critical phase, when the adrenaline of the crash had worn off and the true magnitude of the challenge became clear. Hypothermia, dehydration, injury, and enemy action were all racing to kill her. The winner would depend entirely on her decisions over the next few hours. Ghost broke camp methodically, erasing any sign of her presence. The Taliban patrol would return, probably bringing friends, and she needed to be long gone before they did. She melted ice over a small fire for drinking water, then scattered the ashes and arranged the rocks to look undisturbed. By 700 hours, she was moving again, following the riverbed deeper into the valley system. The landscape was changing as she descended. Patches of scrub vegetation appeared between the rocks, and she began to see signs of seasonal wildlife, old droppings from goats or sheep, scratches on stones where animals had passed. Where there were animals, there might be water sources not marked on her military maps. By mid-morning, she found what she was looking for, a thin stream cutting through the valley floor, probably fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The water was clear and cold, and her purification tablets would make it safe to drink. More importantly, the stream meant she could refill her bottles and extend her survival time indefinitely. She followed the stream for 2 hours, watching it grow gradually larger as tributaries joined from side valleys. This was encouraging. She was definitely moving toward more populated areas, but it also meant increased danger. The Taliban controlled most of these lower valleys, and a stream this size would attract both livestock and the herders who tended them. Ghost was studying her map when she heard voices echoing off the canyon walls. She froze, pressing herself against the rocky slope as the sounds grew closer. Not patrol voices, these were casual, conversational, accompanied by the bleating of goats and the gentle clang of bells. Herders, probably local villagers bringing their animals to water. She watched from concealment as an old man appeared around the bend, driving perhaps 30 goats ahead of him with a long staff. His weathered face spoke of decades in these mountains, and his eyes constantly scanned the terrain with the alertness of someone who'd survived by being careful. A young boy, probably his grandson, trotted alongside the herd, chattering in Pashto as children do everywhere. The herders watered their animals and filled their own bottles from the stream. Ghost remained motionless as they passed within 50 yards of her position, close enough to hear the old man's gentle corrections to the boy, close enough to see the affection in their interaction. These weren't Taliban fighters. They were civilians trying to make a living in an impossible landscape. For a moment, Ghost considered revealing herself. The old man might help her, might guide her toward friendly forces or at least away from Taliban strongholds. But the risk was too great. If word of her presence reached the wrong ears, every fighter in the valley would be searching for the American pilot. She couldn't put the herders in danger, and she couldn't risk her own capture. As the voices faded, Ghost resumed her movement south. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She was passing through lives and communities, invisible and alone, while a little girl in Virginia waited for her mother to come home. The stream led Ghost into her first major decision point. The valley split into 3 branches, each following a different watershed toward the lowlands. Her military map showed the eastern branch eventually reaching a district center with government forces, but it also passed through several known Taliban strongholds. The western branch was largely unpopulated but would take her further from friendly territory. The central route was unmarked, a blank space on the map that could hide anything. Ghost chose the path of maximum uncertainty. The Central Valley was her best option precisely because it was unknown. Taliban forces would expect her to follow marked routes toward government outposts. By choosing the unmapped path, she was gambling on finding a route that bypassed their expectations entirely. The gamble paid off within hours. The Central Valley was wilder than the others, its walls steeper and its floor more broken by fallen rock. But it also showed signs of ancient human use, old stone foundations, terraced areas where crops had once grown, and most importantly, a well-maintained trail that someone had kept clear of debris. This trail was different from the goat paths she'd seen earlier. It was wider, more carefully constructed, with stones placed to provide stable footing across difficult terrain. Someone had built this for regular travel, probably to connect remote communities or to provide access to resources hidden in the mountains. It was exactly what Ghost needed, a route that would carry her south without exposing her to major Taliban positions. By late afternoon, she'd made excellent progress along the ancient trail. The altitude was dropping noticeably, and the vegetation was becoming more diverse. She even spotted a few hardy trees clinging to protected slopes, their branches heavy with what looked like wild fruit. If her food situation became desperate, she might be able to supplement her rations from the land itself. But as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ghost encountered something that stopped her cold. The trail ahead was blocked by a military checkpoint, not Taliban, but not friendly either. Three men in mismatched uniforms sat around a small fire, their weapons within easy reach. Drug smugglers, most likely, or arms dealers using the old trade routes to move contraband through the mountains. Ghost settled into observation position behind a boulder, studying the checkpoint through her scope. The men looked bored but alert, and their equipment was surprisingly sophisticated. Night vision goggles, satellite phones, and weapons that were cleaner and better maintained than most Taliban gear. These weren't desperate fighters hiding in caves. They were professionals running a business. As darkness fell, Ghost faced another critical decision. She could try to bypass the checkpoint by climbing around it, but that would cost precious time and energy. She could wait for the guards to sleep and try to slip past, but that carried enormous risk. Or she could find another route entirely, though that might mean backtracking days through terrain she'd already covered. The sound of vehicles echoing through the valley made the decision for her. Headlights appeared on the trail ahead, and the checkpoint suddenly came alive with activity. Whatever was happening, Ghost needed to be somewhere else when it concluded. She began climbing. The night ascent nearly killed her. Ghost's fractured wrist screamed with each handhold, and the loose scree shifted treacherously under her boots. Several times she found herself sliding backward, clawing desperately for purchase on slopes that seemed determined to throw her into the valley below. But she climbed because the alternative was capture, and capture meant never seeing Aaliyah again. By midnight, she gained enough elevation to see the checkpoint from above. A convoy of 4 vehicles had arrived, their occupants unloading wooden crates under the supervision of the guards she'd observed earlier. The operation was smooth, professional, and completely illegal. Ghost was witnessing a major smuggling operation on one of Afghanistan's oldest trade routes. She photographed the scene with her survival camera, storing evidence that intelligence services would find valuable if she survived to deliver it. But survival was her only priority now. The smugglers would disperse before dawn, and she needed to be well away from their operation before they began securing the area. The descent on the far side of the checkpoint was even more treacherous than the climb. Ghost followed a narrow ledge that had probably been carved by centuries of erosion, placing each step carefully in the darkness. Her night vision was naturally excellent, a genetic gift from her Nigerian father that had served her well in countless combat missions, but even she couldn't see every hazard in the broken terrain. Dawn found her exhausted and bloodied, but alive and free. The checkpoint was miles behind her, and the trail ahead showed no signs of recent use. She'd successfully bypassed the first major obstacle in her escape route, though the cost had been severe. Her water supply was running low from the exertion, and her body was burning through calories at an unsustainable rate. Ghost allowed herself a brief rest in the shelter of an overhanging rock. As she tended to new cuts and scrapes, she thought about the convoy she'd witnessed. The operation was too sophisticated for local criminals, which meant it was probably connected to larger networks, possibly even state actors using the chaos of Afghanistan to move money and weapons. The intelligence value was significant, but only if she lived to report it. She keyed her radio during the morning communication window, whispering her daily report into the static. Ghost 77, Day 4. Continuing movement south. Encountered smuggling operation, bypassed successfully. Request immediate extraction if possible. The silence that answered her was complete. No friendly forces were close enough to receive her transmissions, and even if they were, the terrain made extraction nearly impossible. She was still entirely on her own, still racing against time and circumstance toward a reunion that seemed more unlikely with each passing hour. But Ghost had made a promise to Aaliyah, and she'd never broken a promise to her daughter. She shouldered her pack and continued south, following the ancient trail toward whatever waited in the valleys below. The trail led Ghost into a landscape that seemed drawn from another century. Terraced fields carved into impossible slopes, irrigation channels that had channeled mountain water for 1,000 years, and stone villages that appeared to have grown from the living rock itself. This was the Afghanistan that existed in the spaces between wars, timeless, enduring, and utterly indifferent to the conflicts that raged across its surface. She moved carefully through this ancient world, avoiding the villages but using their presence to navigate. Where there were settlements, there were usually multiple routes in and out, giving her options if one path proved blocked. The people here had been dealing with armed strangers for generations: Russians, British, Americans, Taliban, and they'd learned to survive by being invisible when soldiers passed through. Ghost understood that instinct intimately. She'd been the only woman in most of her military training classes, the only black face in many briefing rooms, the only pilot who'd grown up speaking Igbo before English. She'd learned early that survival sometimes meant being invisible, letting others underestimate her while she quietly outworked and outthought them all. Now that training served her in ways the instructors had never intended. She moved through the landscape like smoke, leaving no sign of her passage, taking nothing that would be missed. Her grandfather's compass guided her south, but her grandmother's wisdom, shared during long summer evenings in Lagos, kept her alive. A woman who travels alone must be twice as clever and half as visible, the old woman had said, not knowing she was preparing her granddaughter for a war on the other side of the world. On the 6th day, Ghost encountered her first real crisis. The trail led to a river crossing where the ancient bridge had collapsed, probably during spring floods years earlier. The water was deep and fast, fed by snowmelt from peaks that scraped the sky. Her map showed no alternative crossings for miles in either direction, and backtracking would cost her days she couldn't spare. She studied the problem methodically, using skills learned during survival training in Alaska. The water was too cold and fast for swimming, especially with her injuries. But upstream, where the river narrowed between rocky banks, fallen trees had created a natural dam. If she could navigate across that tangle of logs and debris, she might reach the other side. The crossing took 3 hours and nearly ended her journey permanently. Twice, she slipped on wet bark and found herself dangling over churning water that would have swept her away instantly. Her fractured wrist couldn't bear much weight, forcing her to rely mainly on her right arm and the strength in her legs. But she made it across, soaked and shivering but alive. Ghost built a small fire on the far bank to dry her equipment and restore her core temperature. As she waited for her clothes to dry, she allowed herself to think about warmth in other forms. Aaliyah's arms around her neck, their apartment's radiator clanking to life on winter mornings, the heated cockpit of her F-35 during high-altitude missions. Warmth was something she'd taken for granted until it became a matter of life and death. The radio check that evening brought unexpected news. As she whispered her daily report into the static, she heard something impossible, a faint voice answering back, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference but unmistakably human. Ghost 77, this is Overwatch. Signal weak but readable, your position. Ghost's heart hammered as she gave her approximate coordinates, trying to keep her voice steady despite the surge of hope. Someone was finally listening, finally close enough to hear her transmissions. Copy your position, Ghost. Search and rescue operations suspended due to weather. Recommend you continue movement south toward Checkpoint Delta. How copy? The transmission faded before Ghost could respond, leaving her staring at the radio in frustration. Checkpoint Delta wasn't on any of her maps, and she had no idea how far south she needed to travel to reach it. But the message was clear. Help was trying to reach her, and she needed to keep moving toward whatever safety waited in the valleys below. As she settled down for another night in the wilderness, Ghost felt something she hadn't experienced since the crash: genuine hope. She was no longer entirely alone. Someone knew she was alive, and they were trying to help her get home to Aaliyah. The sound that woke Ghost on the seventh morning was one she'd hoped never to hear again: the distinctive whine of Taliban motorcycles echoing through the valley. She grabbed her gear and scrambled up the nearest slope, finding concealment behind a cluster of boulders just as the first riders appeared on the trail below. There were 6 of them, heavily armed and moving with purpose. They weren't on patrol, they were tracking something specific. One rider dismounted at the river crossing and examined the ground where Ghost had built her fire the night before. Even from her hiding position, she could see him pointing out sign to the others, following the trail of her passage with uncomfortable accuracy. Ghost had been careless. The crossing had been so difficult, and she'd been so focused on drying her equipment, that she'd forgotten to properly conceal her fire site. Now the Taliban trackers were following her route with the single-minded determination of hunters who'd found fresh spoor. She watched them debate which direction to take, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. They were discussing the river crossing, probably wondering how their quarry had managed to get across without using the damaged bridge. Finally, their leader made a decision. 3 riders would continue south along her actual route, while the other 3 would search for alternative crossings upstream. Ghost waited until both groups had disappeared from view before moving. She had perhaps an hour's head start, maybe less if the trackers were as skilled as they appeared. Her only advantage was knowing the terrain ahead while they had to discover it, but that advantage would evaporate quickly if she couldn't increase her lead. She pushed herself harder than she had since the crash, ignoring the protests from her injured wrist and the growing exhaustion in her legs. The trail wound through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing toward another ridge that blocked her view of the valleys beyond. Each step carried her further from capture, but also burned through energy reserves she couldn't spare. By midday, Ghost could hear the motorcycles again, their engines struggling with the steep terrain but inexorably closing the distance. She needed to do something unexpected, something that would throw off their pursuit while giving her time to reach more defensible ground. The solution came from an unexpected source: her grandfather's compass, and a lesson from survival school she'd almost forgotten. The trail ahead curved sharply to follow the natural contours of the mountainside, but Ghost's compass showed that a more direct route was possible by cutting across a steep slope covered in loose scree. It was exactly the kind of terrain that motorcycles couldn't navigate, but that a trained infantry soldier could cross with care. Ghost left the trail and began picking her way across the unstable slope, moving slowly to avoid triggering a rockslide that would both reveal her position and potentially bury her alive. The gamble worked perfectly. She could hear the motorcycles reaching the point where she'd left the trail, their engines revving as the riders searched for signs of her passage. But the scree field showed no clear tracks, and the Taliban trackers apparently decided she'd continued along the main trail rather than attempt such a dangerous crossing. By evening, Ghost had put miles between herself and her pursuers. She found shelter in a narrow canyon that offered both concealment and protection from the wind, allowing her to risk another small fire. As she heated water for her evening meal, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd outmaneuvered professional trackers using nothing but wilderness skills and superior tactical thinking. But the encounter had cost her precious time and energy. Her food supplies were dwindling faster than planned, and the constant stress of evasion was wearing down her body's reserves. She needed to reach friendly forces soon, or survival itself would become academic. That night, her dreams were filled with the sound of motorcycle engines and Aaliyah's voice calling for her mommy to come home. The eighth day brought Ghost her first glimpse of the world beyond the mountains. From a high ridge, she could see the foothills rolling away toward distant plains, green with cultivation and dotted with the geometric patterns of human habitation. Somewhere in that patchwork of fields and villages lay safety, but between her position and that promised land stretched miles of Taliban-controlled territory. Her radio crackled to life during the morning communication window, bringing news that was both encouraging and terrifying. Ghost 77, this is Overwatch. Intelligence indicates Taliban search teams have been activated in your area. Recommend extreme caution and continued movement toward extraction point. How copy? Ghost whispered her acknowledgement into the radio, grateful for the contact, but alarmed by the intelligence update. If Taliban forces were actively searching for her, it meant someone had connected her crash to the downed F-35. She was no longer just an escaped pilot. She was a high-value target whose capture would be a significant propaganda victory. The trail descended steadily through increasingly populated terrain. Ghost passed abandoned compounds that had probably housed extended families before the latest round of fighting drove them away. These ruins told the story of Afghanistan in miniature: walls built and rebuilt, fields planted and abandoned, lives interrupted by the endless cycle of conflict. In one of these ruins, Ghost made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath fallen masonry, she found a cache of supplies that had probably been left by retreating government forces. The cache contained military rations, medical supplies, and most importantly, a detailed map of the local area marked with current Taliban positions and safe routes toward friendly lines. The map revealed both good news and bad. The good news was that she was closer to extraction than she dared hope, perhaps only 2 days of hard travel from a forward operating base. The bad news was that every direct route lay through Taliban strongholds that were now actively searching for her. But the map showed something else, a route that avoided the main population centers by following a series of abandoned mining tracks through hills that had been stripped of valuable minerals decades ago. It would be longer and more difficult than the direct approach, but it might allow her to reach friendly forces without being detected. Ghost made her decision quickly. She'd take the mining route, trusting her stamina and navigation skills to overcome the extra challenge. As she studied the map more carefully, she began to see the logic of the abandoned mines. They'd been carved into hills that offered excellent views of the surrounding terrain, allowing whoever controlled them to monitor movement across wide areas. If she could reach the mine complex, she'd have both shelter and overwatch positions for the final approach to friendly lines. The afternoon brought her first contact with the mining road, a rough track that had been carved into the hillside by heavy machinery, but had since been reclaimed by erosion and sparse vegetation. Ghost followed the track upward, using the engineered route to make better time while staying alert for signs of current use. The first mine entrance appeared at sunset, a dark mouth carved into the hillside and secured by a rusted metal door that hung askew on broken hinges. Ghost approached carefully, using her flashlight to peer into the depths. The tunnel extended beyond the reach of her beam, disappearing into darkness that could hide anything from abandoned equipment to Taliban weapon caches. But the mine offered something she desperately needed: complete concealment and protection from the elements. After 8 days of sleeping in the open, the prospect of walls and a roof was almost overwhelming. Ghost cleared the entrance area carefully, then settled in for her first comfortable night since the crash. As she prepared her evening meal, she thought about the miners who'd carved these tunnels, probably decades ago when Afghanistan was a different country with different dreams. They dug into the earth seeking wealth, creating spaces that would eventually shelter a pilot seeking nothing more than the chance to return to her daughter. For the first time in over a week, Ghost slept without dreaming of pursuit. The mine complex was larger than Ghost had expected, with multiple levels connected by a network of tunnels that honeycombed the entire hillside. She spent the morning exploring, mapping the layout and identifying potential escape routes if she were discovered. The miners had been thorough in their work, creating a labyrinth that could hide an army if necessary. More importantly, the highest level of the mine opened onto a natural observation post that commanded views of the entire valley system below. Through her scope, Ghost could see Taliban positions exactly where the map had indicated them: checkpoint barriers on the main roads, observation posts on key hilltops, and patrol bases that controlled the approaches to major population centers. But she could also see the forward operating base that represented safety. It was perhaps 12 miles away across terrain that looked deceptively open from her elevated position. The base was clearly American, its geometric precision and defensive layout unmistakable even at distance. Helicopters moved in and out regularly, and she could see the communications arrays that would allow her to coordinate her own extraction once she was close enough. The challenge was crossing those 12 miles without being detected. Taliban positions were sited to create overlapping fields of observation, and the valley floor offered little concealment for a lone traveler. But Ghost's aerial background gave her advantages that ground-bound planners might miss. She could read the terrain like a three-dimensional map, identifying dead spaces and approach routes that would be invisible from the Taliban observation posts. Her plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to sneak through the Taliban positions, she'd go around them entirely by following a route that took advantage of terrain features the enemy couldn't observe from their fixed positions. It would require precise navigation and perfect timing, but it would deliver her to the base perimeter without ever being exposed to direct observation. Ghost spent the afternoon preparing for what would either be her final day of evasion or her last day alive. She cleaned and checked her equipment, treated her injuries as thoroughly as possible, and ate the last of her military rations. Tomorrow, she'd either be eating hot food in a military mess hall or she'd be beyond caring about food at all. As the sun set behind the